right, thank you, Carl, for Bible bag. Mason, you're not really in trouble. Thank you, LaShonda, for those worship songs. Thank you, Ben, for reading that for us. Typically, we'd have the kids depart right now and go to their own class, but because of COVID, we're forced to delay that a little longer. All right, so two more lessons in Deuteronomy, and again, we've entitled this series, One Last Thing Before I Go, and because this is Moses' farewell speech before he dies. And what we're going to read today is really, we're really getting close to the very last things Moses says before he dies. He's about to commission Joshua, and only days after that does Moses die. And so today we're going to talk about, we entitled this particular lesson, The Dilemma of Covenant. And so three things I want us to see from this passage that Ben read. I want us to see the invitation to covenant. I want us to see the dilemma of covenant and the solution to the covenant. The invitation to covenant, the dilemma of covenant, and the solution to the covenant. And so the first thing I want us to see from this passage is the specific invitation to a covenant relationship that is spoken here. This is known as, in Deuteronomy, the covenant renewal ceremony. And it culminates with a song that God gives to Moses. It's called the Song of Moses. I think that's chapter 32. And it ends with the inauguration of Joshua as the new leader. And so covenant, that sounds like an old word. We don't use that a lot today. And in part because we don't really think about relationships covenantally anymore. And so I think the best way to understand a covenant is to understand, is to contrast it with a contract. So you have a covenantal relationship, and then you have a contractual relationship. And so what I want to do first is just, I want to bring out the clarity of what a covenantal relationship is by contrasting it with the other. And that is a contractual relationship. And so there are four, probably more, characteristics of a contractual relationship. Number one, contractual relationships are most often made for a limited period of time. So they're dissolvable, they're temporary. If a certain thing takes place in the course of a contractual relationship, the contract is effectively over. And so we have a number of contractual relationships in our lives today. Anyone from your butcher to your banker to your hairstylist, okay? Contractual relationships are not wrong, but what God calls his people to in this passage is a covenantal relationship. And so, your mechanic, for example, is a contractual relationship where if he holds up his end of the relationship and does good work at a good price, he remains your mechanic. But if you happen to come across a different mechanic who you feel does better work at a better price, well, then that relationship may be over, right? And although most wedding vows today include covenantal statements like "till death do us part" or "so long as we both shall live," although they include those statements in the vows, the truth is, most modern people approach marriage like a contractual relationship. And so modern American society, by and large, believes that marriage is for the personal happiness of those involved, such that if the relationship ever ceases to be personally fulfilling, the relationship can be ended and another started in its place. And so this is the way modern people oftentimes view marriage. It's a contract. It's not a covenant, even if our vows are covenantal. Does that make sense? Secondly, so contractual relationships are made for a limited period of time. They are dissolvable. They are breakable. But secondly, contracts are based on an if-then mentality. So contracts sound like, if you will do A, I will do B. And so if you'll pay the monthly fee, we'll give you roadside assistance. And so in this way, contractual relationships arise from a desire to give in order to receive. Both parties say, we desire B from you, so we'll give you A. In return, it's an if-then mentality. Contractual relationships have very real contingencies because there are contingencies. Contracts can often be volumes long, right? So if you've ever taken out a mortgage or even a car loan, I mean, you signed a book of papers because they want to make sure they get all the contingencies in place because there's a bunch of if-thens that could end the relationship. So contractual relationships are based on an if-then mentality, and for this reason, all of the possible ifs must be written into the contract. Thirdly, contractual relationships are impersonal. Contractual relationships do not require your love or personal loyalty beyond the contractual stipulation. So when you chose Meredith Village Savings Bank over Bank of New Hampshire, you did not pledge your love to Meredith Village, right? You just pledged your money. So contractual relationships are impersonal. They are sort of business relationships. Now, a business relationship, as a Christian, you are obligated to treat, as a Christian, you're obligated to treat people fairly and justly because they're made in the image of God, but you know from the start that you are not forever committed to that person. Business contracts are made and broken daily, on a daily basis, and as a result, contractual relationships are actually fraught with a lot of insecurity. So you know this if you're a business owner. You know what it feels like to need to offer an elite product or service at a fair price so that your contractual relationship with your customer does not suddenly and abruptly end, right? Because especially if you're not the only game in town, you feel this pressure. And so there's insecurity and uncertainty in contractual relationships. And so something I mentioned in our marriage series, I think it was last year, is that if you're in a romantic relationship with a person of the opposite sex and you're living together prior to marriage, you are in a contractual relationship laden with inevitable stress. Why? Well, 83% of those who cohabitate do so in order to, quote, road test the relationship. And so what this means is that people cohabitate to see if this product was really as good as advertised. Okay? And so if this relationship dynamic you choose for dating, or in this dynamic, you better be on your best behavior at all times. Why? Because at any time, a new vendor could step in who offers better value to your significant other than you do, and at that point, you either need to upgrade or, become outdated. So this is a significant reason why those who cohabitate before marriage are 2 to 3 times more likely to divorce, because you both enter into the relationship knowing that it's free to be a short-term thing, right? And we talked about this too. You also can't be truly free to be yourself in this type of relationship because you know that if the person you are living with begins to see that you're not as great as you first appeared to be, which he or she will see. Your hair's not always perfect. You don't always smell good. You're not always happy and in a chipper mood, etc., etc. If you let that stuff show, you might get dumped. Okay? You can't let your guard down, at least if you want the relationship to last. This is a contractual relationship. It's entered into for a limited period of time. It's based on an if-then mentality, and it's very impersonal in nature. So let's contrast that with a covenantal relationship that God invites his people into here in Deuteronomy. Verses 12 and 13, here's the covenantal language. You are standing here in order to enter into a covenant with the Lord your God. A covenant the Lord is making with you this day and sealing with an oath, to confirm you this day as his people, that he may be your God as he promised you, and as he swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So I want you to notice, first of all, we're going to do, I think, three ingredients to a covenantal relationship. Notice, first of all, the inherent longevity of this covenant. So this covenant is intergenerational. God first established the covenant with Abraham back in Genesis 15, 400 plus years before, and he's simply renewing that same covenant in Deuteronomy. Okay? So covenants are not made for a limited period of time. Covenants are enduring. Covenants last. Covenants have no end date, and for this reason they are much more stable and less insecure. And so a man and a woman who know that they are entering into a covenant with each other on their wedding day understand that they're entering into a relationship with built-in security. Now, because they're both human, husband and wife may marry into a covenant, but through mutual or individual selfishness, grow to treat the marriage like a contract and divorce. But if they start their marriage understanding their relationship covenantally and not contractually, then they have some inherent security in the relationship that a contractual one does not have. So a covenant relationship has inherent longevity. It's not for a limited period of time. Secondly, a covenantal relationship is very personal. So verse 12 says, "You are standing here in order to enter into a covenant with the Lord your God, to confirm you this day as his people, that he may be your God." So notice the language of his people, your God. Whenever you speak of another person being yours, you speak personally, right? This is my son. This is my wife. This is my Jeremy or my Susie, right? The language of covenant is possessive. Covenant implies belonging to. I belong to you, you belong to me. I think that's a song, isn't it? A covenantal relationship is very personal, and it actually involves losing some of your rights. So in a covenantal relationship, I give up my right to choose another product at a better price. In a covenantal relationship, I commit till death do us part. I'm in it for richer or poorer. If you happen to discover a year into marriage, which you will, that your spouse is actually more selfish than you ever saw before, and if she happens to make the same observation, which she will, well, there is no plan B. Okay? If you actually made a covenantal relationship, then you give up your right to a better product at a better price. Now, did God give some situations where the covenant could be broken? Yes, but Jesus was clear to say that that was not God's intention. Okay? So a covenantal relationship is very personal, and it's not temporary. Thirdly, a covenantal relationship involves a giving of oneself to the other for the other. Mm-hmm. So God didn't invite the Israelites into covenant with him for his benefit, as if he were going to gain something from them that he didn't have before. God was entering into covenant with the Israelites for their benefit, and the same would be true of them. They were to enter into covenant with God to glorify and praise God, and not for their own benefit alone. Now, each would benefit from the covenant, right? God would be in relationship with people, something he greatly desires, and the people would be in relationship with God, something they greatly desire. But a covenantal relationship is entered into actually for the benefit of the other person. Now, having said that, a covenantal relationship can quickly turn abusive if one person is in it for the benefit of the other and the other's not, right? And so if you're in a relationship in which you are giving, and the other person is not giving at all or not giving as much, then you will quickly feel used or even abused. A covenantal relationship involves the giving of oneself to the other for the benefit of the other, and when both are in the relationship to give and not receive, a beautiful relationship grows. All right, fourthly, I said three, but there's four here. Fourthly, a covenantal relationship is based on steadfast love. So when you make a contract with your insurance company, you don't pledge your love to them, okay? But a covenantal relationship is always based on steadfast love. In fact, the word for steadfast love, or loving kindness in the Bible, a phrase we see often, is it's the word hesed. It's sometimes translated as covenant. Okay? So God invites his people into a covenantal relationship with him that's inherently enduring. It's very personal. It involves the giving of oneself to the other for the benefit of the other, and it's based on steadfast love. Now, so that's the invitation to covenant. So the invitation to a very specific type of relationship. So now let's talk about the dilemma of the covenant, because it's a very real dilemma that Carl talked about in Bible Bag. Another thing we need to know about covenants is this. Covenants include contractual components, but contracts do not include covenantal components. Say it again. Covenants include contractual components, but contracts do not include covenantal components. So, in other words, in a covenant there are if-then stipulations. In fact, the whole of if you read chapter 28 right before this, the whole 60 verses is an if-then statement. I mean, it's the details of a contract. And it reads this way: if you diligently obey the voice of the Lord your God to observe carefully all of his commandments, then the Lord your God will bless you. And then he says, but if you do not obey the voice of the Lord your God to observe carefully all of his commandments and his statutes which I command you today, then all of these curses will come upon you and overtake you. So the blessing statements in chapter 28 are 14 verses long. The curse statements are 53 verses long. So Moses makes it clear that although covenants are enduring and are meant to last forever, it absolutely matters how you live in the covenant. Okay? So God in essence said, I saved you out of Egypt and I made a covenant with you, but you must now live right or I'll destroy you and send you back to Egypt. That's the if-then. And some of the curses in Deuteronomy, you read Deuteronomy 28 and you're going to have to take a break. Because here, it's tough to read. Here's one of the things it says. The Lord will afflict you with madness, blindness, and confusion of mind. At midday you will grope like a blind person in the dark. You will be unsuccessful in everything you do. Day after day you'll be oppressed and robbed with no one to rescue you. This is that if you don't obey me, these are the curses that you'll receive, right? So there are serious stipulations to covenant. And so what we're going to talk about next ought to be a great conversation individually. Because what we're going to talk about is probably the central dilemma of the entire Bible. In fact, modern divisions among Christian denominations today have their root in the dilemma that we're about to talk about. And it's the dilemma of covenant. And so to illustrate this, let me give you an illustration that I've given before. And that is, when Marcy and I were in college, I owned a motorcycle. And I worked at a golf course at the time, and on this particular day, it was early morning, I was driving to work on my motorcycle. And I had to be at work at 7. I think I was on the road roughly 6:30. And so it was late in the fall, and so it was still pretty dark, and I had my motorcycle light on. And I was driving about 35, headlight, helmet, and from a distance, I see a truck coming toward me on the other lane. And as we get closer and closer to each other, I notice that he has his left blinker on, intending to make a left turn across my lane onto an adjacent road there. And all is fine with this scenario until he decides to cross my lane just as I'm about to pass him, as if he doesn't see me at all. And as he begins to cross my lane in this black F-150 truck, I realize that if I slam on my brakes at that moment, I'm going to run right into the side of his truck. Again, I'm going 35 okay? Because there's not enough room. So instead of slamming on my brakes, I decided at the last minute to let off the gas and swerve my bike like that to see if I can get around the front of his truck. And so that's what I do. I swerve, and by the grace of God, I swerved just in the nick of time to make it in front of and around the truck as his front fender hit my rear blinker arm and knocked my blinker arm off. Now, thankfully, the blinker arm protruded from the bike about 3 inches or so he didn't hit the frame of the bike, so I maintained control. So, I get around, and I'm like, oh my goodness, what just happened? And I pull over, and I take my helmet off, and I say, thank you, God, and I check out the damage on my bike, and I'm like, oh, I almost died. And so here's the dilemma. At that point, I had a decision to make. Do I get back on my bike and continue to work, or do I get back on my bike and go find that guy? If I get back on my bike and try to find him, I would get his license plate, and then I'd probably go to the police station and say, this guy just hit me and just ran. Okay? But if I go to work, I'll make it on time, and this guy gets away with hitting me and almost running me over. Okay, so what do? Well, I went to work and told everybody at work what I thought about the guy in the F-150 all day long. Okay. Now, so would it have been wrong for me to have made the opposite decision? No. But here was my dilemma. I could either get on my bike and go after justice, or I could get on my bike and settle for grace, but I couldn't do both, right? In other words, I could not give the guy justice and grace. I had to choose between the two. Because if I gave him grace, that means I don't get justice. I fix his bike on my own, and I don't get justice. But if I got justice, he doesn't get grace. And I can't have it both ways. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And so the central dilemma of all of the Bible is this dilemma. How can God give the grace of which we can't live without, while at the same time administering the justice that his righteousness demands? Because if God chooses the justice route and comes after all of us for our sins, none of us would live to tell about it. Okay? The Bible says, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God and are worthy of judgment from him. But if God chooses not to come after us, but to give us all grace instead, then no one ever gets justice, the justice they deserve, and God's laws ultimately mean nothing, because obviously they don't have to be enforced, they're just words, and we can ultimately do whatever we want. Okay? And folks, I want you to understand that as much as we would love for God to forever take the grace route like I did, at least with us, the truth is the world could not survive under a God who was 100% gracious, but not also 100% just. So think about it. If the God of the Bible were 100% gracious and not equally just, we'd all kill each other. Why? Because if we knew that God would never hold people accountable for their sin in this world, we would feel compelled to hold them accountable ourselves. Mm-hmm. And what we ought to know about our own hearts by now is that when we seek vengeance on somebody, when we seek to give them back what they gave to us, the anger we feel in our hearts that compels us to get vengeance never brings about the righteousness of God. We will always go beyond justice. And so this is why someone else besides ourselves needs to administer the justice for us. Because we'll go above and beyond. Okay? Needs to go to the courts, and somebody else needs to give him the penalty, because I'll overgive. Okay? In fact, in 1996, Miroslav Volf wrote a book called Inclusion and Embrace, in which he said the only means of prohibiting all recourse to violence by ourselves is to insist that judgment is legitimate only when it comes from God. He says the practice of non-violence requires a belief in divine vengeance. He goes on to say, it takes the quiet of a suburban home to believe that human non-violence results from a belief in God's refusal to judge. He said, in a land soaked in the blood of the innocent, it will inevitably die. That is this idea that non-violence results from a God who doesn't judge. It will inevitably die with other captivities of the liberal mind. So Wolf says you can't live in a non-violent society long unless the citizens of that society believe that ultimately God will bring justice to those who do injustice. Right? All right, so this is the central dilemma in all of the Bible. How can God be 100% gracious while remaining 100% committed to justice as well? How can God give the guy in the F-150 grace while at the same time giving him justice? Because for me, I can only do one or the other. And so because this is such a potent dilemma from beginning to end in the Bible, Christian denominations tend to side on one side or the other. So denominations who side on the side of grace say, yes, we should keep God's law. God wants us to do right. Doing right is the only proper response to grace, but ultimately, even if you don't do right, as long as you've surrendered to Jesus at some point in your life, God's grace covers you in the end. These are, they might be called the once saved, always saved congregations. They preach eternal security. They are less concerned with the reformation of your life and more concerned with your profession of faith. They also tend to be the more liberal churches. But now on the other side, we have denominations who side on the side of justice. They say, yes, God is loving. Yes, he's gracious. Yes, Jesus' blood washes away all of our sin. But if we don't follow his law and instead just live however we want to live, he's not going to save us in the end. And so these denominations do not believe in once saved, always saved. And they tend to be more conservative and more legalistic churches. And ironically, the grace denominations and justice denominations both have a bucket of scriptures to support their stances. And so, if you were to imagine, if you were to put a Christian from a grace church and a Christian from a justice church together in the same room to argue their positions, the grace person will say, so you believe we're saved by works, is that what you're saying? And the justice person would say, so you believe a person can just live however they want to live and call themselves a Christian. Is that what you're saying? And the two will remain in perpetual and eternal argument because both have many scriptures to support their beliefs. This is the Bible's central dilemma and the root of the divisions among so many churches today. How can God have grace on us while remaining 100% committed to justice at the same time? This dilemma is also the reason many readers of the Bible conclude that the Old Testament describes a God of justice or judgment, and the New Testament describes a God of grace or love. They think of the God of the Old Testament as different than the God of the New Testament. I mean, have you ever thought that in your own reading of the Bible? Like, it seems like a stark contrast. And so part of the reason God appears different under the Old and New Covenants is because under the Old Covenant, God's grace was there, but not 100% of it. God's grace was there, for example, in all of the animal sacrifices because the animals got God's judgment, giving the people God's grace, but we know that those sacrifices were only a shadow of God's grace, right? They were a shadow of the good things to come. All right, so this is the dilemma of covenant. It's a serious dilemma that we face even today. So what's the solution? We'll close with that. What's the solution? To see the solution, we have to back up all the way up to the first time God made a covenant with Abraham. And this was really, really cool. I want you to see this. In Genesis 15, God made a covenant with Abraham, and the covenant involved a covenant ceremony. Okay, Deuteronomy 29 is a covenant renewal ceremony. This initial covenant with Abraham involved a ceremony, and the ceremony went like this. Genesis 15, verse 5. Look now toward heaven, and count the stars if you're able to number them. And he said, so shall your descendants be. And Abraham believed the Lord, and God accounted it to him for righteousness. And then he tells Abraham what to do to inaugurate, if you will, this covenant. He said, bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abraham brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. So in those days, we've said before, if you made a covenant with someone, you obviously didn't sign documents and put it in a filing cabinet. Okay? Instead, one of the things they used to do was what God had Abraham do here. They would take an animal, they would cut it in two, and arrange the halves opposite each other with space in the middle. And the person who was making the covenant would then, in the presence of the person he's making the covenant with, walk between both halves and effectively say to the person, if I do not keep the terms of this covenant that we have just agreed upon, may I become like the animal I walk between. That makes sense? Mm-hmm. In the covenant, the person was pledging with his life that he would be faithful to the covenant being established. And the astounding thing about this covenant ceremony with Abraham and God is what happens next. That night, a deep sleep fell upon Abraham. He was called Abram at that point, and he had a nightmare. It says, behold, horror and great darkness fell upon him. Then Abraham heard God say this, know for certain, this is in a dream, know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. Verse 17. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram. So I want you to see what happened there. This is God's covenant commitment to Abraham. And the dream Abraham had was a dream in which God, not himself, passed through the pieces. Okay? And what God was saying was this: if I do not keep this covenant I make with you and your ancestors today, then may I become like these animals I pass between. God passed through the pieces himself and said, I will be faithful to the covenant forever. But here's the thing. God knew that Abraham and his descendants would not be faithful to the covenant forever. In fact, the song that God gave Moses in Deuteronomy 32 is a song that basically says that after Moses dies, all of you will abandon the covenant. Read that song, and it's just, here's what you will do. Okay? God knew that Abraham's descendants would not be faithful to his covenant, and God knows we won't be faithful to it either. Okay? At least not 100%. And so the most amazing thing about God passing through the pieces of the animals in Genesis 15 is that God did not ask Abraham to pass through as well. And here's why. Because God would ultimately pass through for both of them. Amen. Folks, the dilemma of the covenant ultimately finds a solution in Jesus Christ. When Jesus went to the cross, he fulfilled the covenant for us and for him. In his life and on the cross, Jesus was 100% obedient to God's covenant. He was obedient to death, even death on a cross. For this reason, he was worthy of all of God's blessings. But on the cross, Jesus took upon himself the curse we deserved. On the cross, Jesus got 100% of the justice we deserved, and on the cross, Jesus offered us 100% of God's grace.
Thank you.
Okay? In the cross, the dilemma is solved. It's not one or the other. Jesus was the embodiment of the full righteousness of the law that God required, but on the cross, Jesus also took upon himself the curse that we all deserved. And so Jesus became the righteousness of God for us. Jesus passed through for us and for him. Okay? And so on the cross, God was 100% faithful to his need for justice, and on the cross, God was 100% faithful to our need for grace. Jesus passed through the pieces for us.
Thank you, Father.
Okay?
Thank you, Lord.
And so which is it? Are we once saved, always saved, or is obedience required? Yes! Yeah, that's the answer. The answer is yes. You can't separate them. 100% obedience is required, and 100% of grace is required for us, and Jesus was both of them. And so here's how this plays out in daily life. If you know this in your heart, then you've begun to understand what it means to live by faith. Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him as righteousness. So what did he believe? Abraham believed that God would somehow keep the covenant for both of them. And this shows us the nature of biblical faith. Biblical faith is walking in complete dependency, not on my goodness, but on his goodness. Not on my obedience to the law, but on Jesus' obedience to the law for me. And a believer who sees this will never, ever, ever justify his own sin. A believer who sees this will never say, I can do just whatever I want to do. Oh, no. Jesus fulfilled my end of the covenant for me, and I would rather die than continue to spit in his face with the sin that he died for. I mean, how ungrateful would that be? But a believer, when she sins, will also never despair. Why? Because Jesus' righteousness saves her, not her own. Okay? And so if you're a liberal Christian or a conservative Christian today, you don't get it. You must be both. And the only way to do so is through Jesus Christ.
Amen.
Okay? And so as we prepare to surround communion again, let me ask you, are you in a covenantal relationship with God through Jesus Christ? Do you, like Abraham, believe that God kept the covenant for you on the cross? If you believe this, have you followed it up with that beautiful covenantal ceremony of baptism? That's your first step. Are you in a secure and enduring covenantal relationship with God through Jesus? If not, why not? Let's do it today. Let me ask you this also. What sins are you justifying? What sins are you refusing to get help with? In what ways are you depending on your own strength to fight your flesh instead of depending on his strength to fight for you? Jesus became the righteousness of God for you, and it's only by his Spirit living in you that actual practical freedom is available. What sins of your past are you still hanging on to that have kept you from walking closely with Christ day in and day out? Would you lay them at the cross today? Let me say this also as a practical application. If Jesus passed through for us, there is absolutely no way we can ever look down on anybody else. Because I am not saved, I'm not a Christian, I'm not free in the end because of what I've done, but because Jesus passed through for me. And so racism goes away.
Hallelujah.
Okay. Pride goes away. Rich and poor goes away. As the rich say, it's my obligation to be generous. Right? All of it goes away when we humble ourselves before this truth. And so, what do you need to lay at the cross today? Are you surrendering everything in your life to Jesus Christ, and are you seeking one for him every day? That's what we say here. That's our mission. Surrendering all, seeking one. What's your next step?